Well, here we find ourselves. I still remember when I was a child, there was a book we always used to read, and it was called The Monster at the End of the Book. And you would go through the book, and at the very end, there was supposed to be a ferocious monster waiting at the end of the book. But the ferocious monster turned out to be Grover, a friendly, happy monster, and everything was fine. Well, we are at the monster at the end of the book. There is no monster at the end of the book. That's always the thing. But we are here at the end of the course. Seems like just yesterday this all started. But yeah, we've gotten through the summer. Our roughly 11 or 12 weeks that we've been at it, and other than some peer scholar drama, which is my fault, I apologize for that. I've certainly enjoyed teaching you. I've felt it was, I've learned a lot. I learn every time I teach. And it's just been a fascinating summer, kind of thinking about all this stuff in light of the COVID situation we're in now. It's such an interesting time to be a psychology student and a psychologist because, we always say psychology is all around us, but whew, is it ever now? Okay, so where we are now is we've gone through 15 chapters, and this lecture, Module 11C, is going to be on the 16th chapter. Here we go. The history of the future of psychology. How's that for a mind messer-upper? It's just some loose ends here, and I'm not going to totally follow the textbook here, so you will be tested on the textbook, right? So that's the stuff to kind of go through and get. But a lot of the stuff in this chapter just feels like his thing on modernism and postmodernism and Victorian. Okay, whatever. And he talks a lot about paradigms as well. Does psychology have a paradigm? Did it go through paradigm shifts? Yada yada yada. All well and good, I guess. But it's nothing that I thought was too complicated. It was just a bunch of stuff that they're talking about. So I'm going to do a little bit of that. I'll cover some of what's in the chapter, and then I'm also going to add a little bit to try to give you guys what I think is a more of a proper ending for this course. Okay, so let's just jump right into it. So this is from the textbook, and I think it's kind of interesting to, we've talked about this. Okay, psychology began as experimental psychologists studying the mind, but then it went through all these changes. But then we hit Freud, and suddenly clinical psychology was born, and thereafter people thought of those as sort of two things, clinical versus experimental. And then of course with behaviorism coming in, experimental got very experimental, right? The logical positivist kind of notion, and even with cognitive psychology coming up, they've kind of kept that, and so we've had that sort of, they talked about the behaviorists and the psychoanalysts, and then the humanists tried to be the third force. I wouldn't just put it as the behaviorist anymore. I really think there is a strong experimental psychology core, and it's in a lot of different fields. We'll talk about some of those fields in a moment. And there is a strong clinical applied group. And in fact, once you go to applied more generally, it's not necessarily just clinical either. It's not just therapy. It's things like school psychologists that are providing counseling and stuff in schools, but also, applying, say, cognitive psychology to education. So there's almost sort of two branches you can think of: those that are trying to discover new stuff, and that's the experimentalist, and those that are trying to apply what we know to the world for positive effect, and those are the more applied people. I started in the first camp as a real cognitive psychologist, and I still have a foot in that camp, but I'm much more an applied kind of person now. So at any rate, at some point people have tried to kind of look at how these various disciplines are becoming stronger or weaker. And here's one particular look at that, where they went to a bunch of journals and they looked at keywords related to these topics just to see how frequently they were cited, how many articles, what percent of articles had those keywords within them in some way. And they're just kind of looking at, well, let's start with psychoanalysis, for example, and that's these squares right here. And what you see is quite a bit of talk of that in the 50s and 60s, and then it wanes a little bit through the 70s and 80s and kind of comes back up in the 95, 2000, and then kind of drops back down. So what this is saying is, psychoanalysis still is out there. It's still being talked about, but it's certainly not taking taking off by any means. It seems to be sort of percolating along at a lower level. Which one do we do next? Sort of behaviorism. Let's do behaviorism because we talked about that. So that's these diamonds. And so what you see here is, it was just emerging in the 50s, but then it emerged with a vengeance in the 60s up to the 70s, and this was sort of the pinnacle of behaviorism. So a lot of articles talked about behavioral analyses and such, and then that dropped off from that point. And it didn't disappear; it's still around, but again, it's down here sort of with psychoanalysis as percolating things. Whereas the things that really took off are cognitive and neuroscience and cognitive neuroscience. So if we do cognitive first, the circles, you see it just starting to grow in the 60s, 65, 70s. Where did I lose my circle here? But you see it does take off. And as behaviorism is dropping, cognitive psychology is taking off, and it's sort of staying really, really high. So this sort of approach to psychology is still out there. And of course, the one right beside it here, the diamonds that just keeps going up pretty much, is neuroscience. So neuroscience has really gained in popularity. And this little white set of dots here is cognitive neuroscience. So the combination of those two things is also growing in popularity. So on the experimental side, this is a sort of picture of where things are, where cognitive neuroscience is a very dominant field right now in the era that you guys are living in. And so in fact, when I kind of think about things, this is what I imagine. There's this computational cognitive neuroscience. This is the really stringent sort of theoretical part of things that combines knowledge of the brain, the actual anatomy of the brain, with the processes that the brain is using to accomplish the feats, and when possible to model those all in computational models in the way I was describing last time, like those neural network models. This is the real earnest scientists are kind of in here, and they're very happy about the rigor that they're bringing to bear. They now have new toys, of course, the MRIs, the fMRIs, all that kind of stuff. So we have a precision of being able to look at the brain that we never had before. We also have developed a bunch of good strategies for trying to get at cognitive processes, and these things are getting specific enough that we can actually model some of these things. And so to some extent, this is the heart, but a lot of these other areas overlap with that. So, things like there used to be a social psychology that was very distinct from everything else. But now there's social neuroscience. And in fact, when you look at social neuroscience, it's probably better called social cognitive neuroscience. That, a lot of the things we're learning from cognitive psychology are relevant to our social interactions. And so the people doing the social psychology work are bringing that social dimension into the picture. And so we see, a lot of overlap there. There are still some people just doing social psychology. But what I'm suggesting is these things that maybe were separate balloons are kind of being pulled towards this center of gravity, which is where we seem to be getting our clearest, strongest data. And that's why that's being pulled in. Similarly, individual differences research, there's some people that are just doing the kind of thing that Galton started long ago. But often, again, if we can connect this to the brain, if we can connect it to cognitive algorithms, that seems to give it a little more meat and relevance in today's world. And the one I really want to focus on here for a moment is clinical. Because when I described Freud's influence, I think I described it as like a fork in the road, that psychology suddenly went off in these two separate directions. The experimental approach and then the clinical approach that didn't care much about data. It just wasn't experimentalists that sort of launched the clinical thing. It was doctors, and it's much more of a treatment kind of approach than it is, finding the truth kind of approach. And so it's not as connected to science, or at least it wasn't. And I want to kind of express that by talking a little bit about our context, University of Toronto. For many, many, many years, University of Toronto did not have a cognitive psychology faculty member, for one thing, yet let alone a program. We did not hire clinical psychologists within the university because we considered clinical psychology not scientific. And at U of T in general, we have a very scientific bias towards our approach to psychology. So we are in this, camp of the experimentalists for the most part. And clinical psychology was just seen as too fluffy, too non-evidence-based, and we didn't really want any part of it. And so that's why early on, York University really became the place to do clinical psychology if you were in Toronto. However, that changed. Let me come back to that. I'm going to come back to that thing. That changed. I should have flipped my slides. Clinical psychology has become much more almost what you see here, science and practice. It used to be just practice, right? Somebody said, oh, I think I know how everything works and I have my theory and I'm going to use that to try to diagnose you and help you. Now we're doing a lot of research on clinical sorts of issues. We can look at the brain of people who are suffering from various issues, and we can look at how therapy maybe changes how the brain functions and all these things. So these paths that diverged are coming back together, and this is why we at UT Scarborough not that long ago started the first graduate training in clinical psychology at the University of Toronto. There is nowhere else except here at University of Toronto, Scarborough. And again, that's because they didn't want anything to do with it. But what we were able to convince them about 10 or more years ago is that clinical psychology has changed. Clinical psychology is evidence-based now and wants to be more evidence-based. And we wanted to be part of leading that charge of an evidence-based clinical psychology. And we made that argument strongly enough that we were able to hire a bunch of faculty and start a program here at UTSC that's now accredited. So, that's literally where you guys are on this history of psychology. So I wanted to kind of give you that sense as well. All right, let me go back to that previous slide I skipped quickly. This is just connecting with something in the textbook where they're basically saying, and they say this, it's almost like this Spencerian differentiation. You know how Spencer suggested that as entities evolve, we see all this variation kind of emerge, and sort of part of Darwin's theory as well. Well, as psychology evolved, it also showed a lot more variation. And so this is just kind of a step through the APA, the American Psychological Association, has these divisions, and these divisions change, and new ones are added. Things are sometimes taken away. But this will show you that if you came in 1945 to an APA conference, these were the different sort of sub disciplines where you might go and hang around, for example, with other educational psychologists, if you were me. And these might be the people you want to talk to, whereas somebody else might be interested in the teaching of psychology. And so there's, they could be hanging out with that group, etc. Now, as time went by, more and more of these divisions got added. Interestingly, psychoanalysis just seems to be here. That's interesting. I mean, we have psychotherapy here, but I guess now there's a division just about psychoanalysis. But now all of these, so it's not like the 45 ones went away. Now all of these are different subtypes of psychology. So psychology has certainly, become many different things to many different people, and that's why when they talk about the paradigm, does psychology have a paradigm per se? Are we still pre-paradigmatic? That must be it. Are we still there? Is a paradigm waiting for us around the corner? This is the stage. Psychology is still young. It's still growing, and I hope you guys now see literally the variety of it, both in terms of what people are interested in, but also how they study those things, the techniques they use, how they come to conclusions. Whether it's case studies, whether it's individual difference kind of correlation approaches, whether it's causal experiments, etc. All sort of tools in the bag. The other thing I just wanted to mention here, I wanted to add to the story a little bit in the textbook. The textbook talks about, that clinical experimental division, and that there only used to be the American Psychological Association. But over time, because there were all these new things, and a lot of these were applied areas of psychology, community psychology, so applying it to building communities, consumer psychology, applying it to spending behavior, health psychology, applying psychology to physical health, etc. Because there were so many applied that the experimentalists started to, what do we have? Experimental psychology over here. The experimentalists started to feel like They were just one tiny thing in this huge conference that was mostly applied people. And they didn't necessarily have a lot of respect for applied people because they believe in evidence bases behind everything. And so they split off a lot of the experimentalists and formed the Association for Psychological Science. And they had their own meetings that were just experimentalists. And so, that split kind of happened in America. And it also happened in Canada. So it's almost the exact same thing. We had the Canadian Psychological Association. It was the only one for a while, but just like in the States, the experimentalists didn't like it and ended up splitting off their own group, which is CSBBCS, the Canadian Society for Brain, Behavior, and Cognitive Science. Think of that for a moment, with respect to that cognitive neuroscience last slide. Canadian Society for Brain, Neuroscience, Behavior, Behaviorism, Cognitive Science. Brain, behavior, and cognitive science. So we're kind of bringing those dominant things together. What's not there? Clinical, right? Those clinical people can go to CPA. So this still exists, by the way, this distinction, despite what I said here. I do think these two areas are coming together, but there is still the feeling of that split between psychology in the therapeutic sense and psychology in the scientific sense. And that's why you'll often see a lot of experimentalists rolling their eyes when students come into the classroom talking about, I don't know, CTSI or something they saw on Dr. Phil or whatever. And the scientists are like, so that just continues to this day. All right, is that the monster at the end of the book? That's the monster at the end of the book. I thought a good crying face would fit here. Of course, it isn't really the end of the book. It is the end of the lectures, the lecture component of this. We are starting to grade Peer Scholar, or will be soon, and we'll try to get those grades to you certainly before the final exam. And I will be in regular touch with you through announcements. And of course, you can continue to email me as we go from here to the final exam. My plan is to have a practice M-tuner between now and then, so I'll be posting a lot of much more specific information about the final exam so that you all have a good sense of what to expect. But I'll also be posting a practice M-tuner. I may reopen some of the previous ones if you want to use those to practice as well. And I'll probably post something where I give you guys some suggestions about how to best prepare for the final exam. It'll be stuff you already know because you're all psychologists, right? What can I tell you guys that you don't know? Anyway, cool. In the meantime, maybe you'll see me on news every now and then. I seem to be popular on news these days. And I look forward to seeing some of you guys in person again. So, when this is done and we run into each other in the halls at UTSC, feel free to say, hey, I was one of your students in the history of psych class over the summer. It'd be nice just to meet some of you guys in person. Cool. I hope you enjoyed the course. I enjoyed it. And I look forward to maybe teaching you again in another context. Until then, I wish you all the best. And I'll be in touch as we get to the final exam. Signing out. Over and out. Bye-bye, guys.